Next item. Yeah. There's all, and can you hear me okay?
Yeah, pretty good.
Okay. So there's always been a lot of interest by groups and associations that have us come in and talk about the citations that Oregon is writing. And since Oregon OSHA has been keeping statistics on citations going back to 2008, I thought it would be a good idea to take a look at those hazards that Oregon OSHA has been citing in the last 12 years. There's always, like I say, there's been a lot of interest in just what it is Oregon OSHA is citing. It's kind of like reading the tea leaves in the bottom of a cup. If you can just figure out what OSHA is going to cite, then we can be able to keep those hazards out of our workplace. Well, as much as we communicate and make known what our compliance officers have been citing year in, year out, reading those tea leaves hasn't been a silver bullet. But if you want to keep those top cited hazards out of your workplace, there is a path that's been known for decades, and we'll talk about that. So if you want to go to the next slide. So I've grouped the specific citations that Oregon OSHA has written into related hazards rather than looking at the specific written rule. And if you look at this, you'll see that hazard communication is on top. Been there every year for 12 years. Fall hazards comes in second, been there all 12 years. And this is specifically construction. And then safety committee meetings, all 12 years, it's been on the top citation list. Electrical standards, and we'll look at those specific rules later, but been there every year. Lockout, tagout, been there every year. Employer responsibilities, we'll talk about that later, but it's been there every year. Machine guarding, every year. Brace of wheel guarding, almost every year. Forklift operator training, all 12 years. Fire extinguisher inspections, all 12 years. Respiratory, 12 years. Eye wash, shower stations, 10 years. Bloodborne pathogens, 8 years. Personal protective equipment assessment, eye protection, 6 years. Exits, 6 years. Hard hats, 4. Using compressed air for cleaning purposes, 3 years. Open-sided platforms under the old rule once back in 2008. And the new 4-foot general industry fall protection, it's only been around a couple years, but it's made that top list. So the truth is we've known for decades what Oregon OSHA is going to cite. And unfortunately, it'd be a pretty safe bet to know what's going to be cited next year and the year after. You know, we need to be thinking about these ones that stay with us year after year, what to do about them. So can you go to the next slide, Mike? So when you look at the number of citations that have been written since 2008, hazard communication comes in first with nearly 10,000 tickets, followed with safety committees and safety meetings pushing 8,000. Then fall protection was 6,000, and fourth, electrical hazards comes in with about 5,000 tickets. So if you want to go to the next slide. So let's look at hazard communication, almost 10,000 citations in that 12-year period. Now the rules that were cited, written program, you know, that's made all 12 years, which is, you know, there's templates out there that it's not that difficult to put together a written program. Safety committee or safety data sheets, in this day and age, you can go online, and for any chemical, you bring in the workplace, it's not that hard to get a safety data sheet. Training and instruction. A lot of resources out there for training and instruction these days. Warning labels. As you can see, all 4 of these have made all 12 years running, except 1 year where warning labels didn't. So these are the rules our compliance officers are finding that aren't being followed in Oregon workplaces. That pretty much tells us that hazard communication, which is our means to protect our workers from detrimental effects of chemicals, is not being followed very well. Next slide, please. So back in 1985, I was a brand new compliance officer, and I remember being in a chrome plating shop with vats of chemicals, none of them labeled. Today you can Google and you can find out that those vats would have been alkaline and acid vats, and workers would have had serious exposures to hexavalent chromium, all very hazardous. Like I say, those tanks weren't labeled. The workers I talked to, they didn't know what was in the vats or the hazards. And as I remember, there's a real lack of PPE. And what strikes me most is I remember the rash that these guys had. Now, at that time, the hazard communication rules were really new and not being followed very well. And it wasn't very easy for me to figure out what was in those vats. It was not as easy as is today. So you fast forward to 2018 and look at that 55-gallon drum of THF that I found in an Oregon workplace. Other than some pictograms, the information available to those workers in that shop wasn't a whole lot more than I found decades ago. Next slide, please. So if you take a look at the picture on the left, you'll see the grape Gatorade container. It's containing sulfuric acid. And notice the guy holding the sulfuric acid, his lack of PPE. Then you see that little line of coffee, drinking water, MEK, THF. That was the workstation where that drum of THF was. So here we have, in 2018, a worker using unlabeled hazardous chemicals. And then you look at the top picture, there's every place I go into, I'll find a gallon jug or something that has, it's the mystery container. Next slide, please. So if you take a look at here, what are the hazards? Pretty clear that we have fall hazards. You slip and fall, you're gonna get hurt serious. You're in an excavation without protection, death. You're around power lines, electrocution, machine guarding, amputation, serious injuries. So often our prevention efforts go to those immediate and catastrophic safety hazards, but when we can't see the effects that don't show up, they tend to get ignored. So back in the late 1970s, I was falling timber in the woods industry, and timber companies gave us these little squeeze bottles full of herbicide, Tordon, Garlon, those type of things. They had purple dye in it. We had no clue what it was, other than it was part of the hack and squirt program where you cut a deciduous tree down, you kill the roots with that liquid. We had no PPE, no information, And when you were in town, you could always tell when people were doing the hack and squirt because they'd have purple pants. 1981, I was planting trees, and those trees, a lot of them were covered in thyrum, which at that time I had no idea what it was. Now I know, pretty hazardous stuff. Had no information on it, no PPE, no washing, and we were eating lunch crammed into crummies and vans on wet days, So our exposures were pretty high, and then that's just me. If you look at your own work history and you think about things you've done over the years, and those chemical exposures that happened years ago, it can be pretty serious. So if you can switch to the next slide, please, Mike. So we take a look at this here, what are the hazards of the fireplace, a dryer, a furnace, stove, water heaters? Well, we all know in the safety world, you got the risk of carbon monoxide. Can't be seen, can't be smelled, can't be heard, and but it can be stopped with some training and the right equipment and procedures. So the tough thing about chemical hazards is you generally can't see those hazards, even with something as deadly as carbon monoxide. And then think about the hundreds of hazardous chemicals that are used out in our workplace where the effects may not show up for years. The CDC, Center for Disease Control and Prevention, we're all really familiar with now. They say that more than 32 million workers in the United States are potentially exposed to chemicals that can be absorbed through the skin. And if you go to the federal OSHA website, they say that there's probably 190,000 illnesses and 50,000 deaths annually from chemical exposures. That's a pretty big number. And then, like I say, you start looking at, for those of us who have been in the workforce for a long time, what kind of exposures did we have, decades ago that may come back and cause us some problems. Next slide, please. So let's talk about where Oregon OSHA's focus has been as far as penalties. Take a look at hazard communication rules. Less than 500,000. Fall protection, pushing 6.5 million. Again, the immediate consequence hazard gets the attention. The rules we use to determine penalties make it more difficult to address what may happen down the road. But that's a topic for another day, and how we achieve greater compliance with our hazard communication rules to protect our workers from chemical hazards going forward. That's an important question we need to face. But for now, let's look at that gorilla in Oregon, fall hazards. Can you go to the next slide, please? So we take a look at fall protection over the 12 years, like I say, almost $6.5 million in fines. And remember, we're talking about only construction. There's 108,000 construction workers in Oregon in 2019, 1.77 million workers in Oregon same year. So it kind of gives a light on how much focus is directed to construction. Now, the 4 rules that fall under this hazard category would be the 6-foot trigger height. As of a few years prior to that, it was a 10-foot trigger height. Use of ladders. Are we extending the ladder above the eave? Are we securing them? What's the condition of the ladder? What kind of training? And then certification of fall protection. Construction fall protection training needs to be documented. And then the fall protection training program itself, not having it or having an adequate program. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at the percentage of fatal falls to lower level heights, 2017, I believe, is nationwide. I wanted to point out 25% are under 10 feet. There's always still a lot of talk about why that rule is where it's at, but as these figures show, there's definitely a need for rules for these lower heights. Next slide, please. So looking at a compensable fatality table from DCBS from 2004 to 2018, you take a look at that and you say, well, what gives here? You know, there's a drop in fatalities in the 2008, 2009, and that wasn't because we're starting to protect our workers from falls, it's because we weren't working because of the recession. But what kind of really strikes me is you look at the fatality number back in 2006, 2007, 2018, 2019, they're the same, 14. You know, we haven't apparently made a lot of progress. So that's the million-dollar question. Next slide. So when I started out as a compliance officer back in 1985, the rules on fall protection were pretty weak. Fall protection equipment was basically non-existent. There was times you might see a manila rope tied around the waist of a roofer while his buddy held him on a steep roof. Wasn't a lot of effort put into fall protection back then. Safety belts were high tech. And now, you know, if you look at what we have, one, we know that there's a lot of tickets being written for lack of fall protection, so there's a lot of interest there. But if you look at the types of fall protection gear that's available, they're just for every type of situation, there is a fall protection system or gear that would aid workers. And a lot of contractors are using this effectively and efficiently. There's lots of different training available out there in the world. So the question is, why are we still killing our workers by falls? Next slide, please. So if you take a look at this manufactured anchor that was used on a Oregon job site less than 2 years ago, there's one sheet metal screw holding the anchor into the plywood on a steep roof. So what's going to happen if this guy slips and he rolls 20 feet on an 812 pitch and his safety rope and lanyard snap as his 200-pound force reacts against the anchor? Pretty good chance he's going off the edge and he's going to join that fatality list. But as you can see, you know, the manufacturer of that anchor is pretty clear. They want every hole filled with something. Not only do they want it filled with something, but they tell you exactly what they want. The type of nails, the type of screws. So you have to wonder why the sheet metal screw was being used. It's lack of training, lack of safety culture. Those are important questions. Next question, please. Slide. Here's another example. This is another Oregon workplace I was in the last couple of years. Now there's electric eye at the top of that small hopper that tends to get dirty, and a worker has to climb up on this step ladder. They have to stand on the top of the ladder to be able to reach and clean that eye. So one of the reasons we killed 14 workers by falls in 2019, and that our Oregon OSHA compliance officers are writing millions of dollars in tickets, is because of all the unsafe acts that are happening every day in our workplaces. This should bring to mind the Heinrich safety pyramid. If you're not familiar with it, Google it. So that leaves us with a question. How do we cut those unsafe acts where our workers are not using fall protection or using fall protection incorrectly. Next slide. So let's look at lockout tagout. Top 25, 12 of 12 years, over 1,800 violations, over $700,000 in fines. When I started with OSHA, we didn't have a very good lockout rule, and deaths and serious injuries were common. The lockout, as we know it today, was non-existent. But we continue to maim and kill our workers who are servicing and maintaining our equipment, machinery, and vehicles. You know, our lockout rules put into effect back in 89 and 90, and when followed, that allows our workers to do service and maintenance work safely. This is certainly a case of a rule that when followed, it saves lives. Unfortunately, as shown, you know, the rule is being ignored too often. You know, I was in a workplace, 15, 20 years ago, big mill, plywood facility. We're there at night, and we were walking through the facility, and they had an automatic stacker, and there were about 3 or 4 guys doing service or maintenance on it, no lockout tagout. Well, you know, we addressed the situation, got the guys out of the machine, which was fine, but about that time, here comes this big guy across the way, and the closer he got, the redder his face got. And he got there, and he started hollering in, you know, not polite language about what was going on. I said, well, I'm from Oregon OSHA, and he cut me off and said, well, I don't care where you're from. Here at XYZ company, that's not how we do things. So part of it also is culture that's out there. We're improving in that, but we still have a ways to go. Next slide, please. And these are just a couple examples of what I have seen in Oregon workplaces recently. So we have a rip saw that's plugged up. It's still running, not locked out. We've got a couple guys in there trying to get it going. Then you look at the picture on the right. If you notice where the operator station is and where the disconnects are. So to get to the disconnects, he has to go through the machine rather than having a disconnect there at his operator station. To get to those disconnects any other way than that is a 5 or 10 minute journey through the mill. So like hazard communication and fall protections, we need to be asking, we need to ask what needs to happen to get a greater level of buy-in on following energy control rules. Next slide. So let's look at fire extinguishers. 12 out of 12 years, over 2,700 violations, close to $20,000 in penalties. So what is this saying about the value some Oregon workplaces put on basic life safety precautions? Not keeping up on something as simple as keeping fire extinguishers charged, inspected, and located so they can be reached easily and readily to use. It says something about our focus on worker safety. We need to be taking care of these kind of details to protect our workers when a fire breaks out. Now, I got an email just within the last couple of weeks from a small employer that I've worked with in the past. They had a major fire, burned their shop to the ground. They said that the fire and explosion happened exceedingly fast, and their emergency action plan, including the use of fire extinguishers, allowed them to evacuate in 45 seconds, and they firmly believe that saved their lives. So, you know, there's a reason why the fire extinguishers that need to be in the workplace, and when they're there, they need to be inspected, charged, ready to be used. Next slide. And then electrical standards. We're looking, over 5,000 citations, close to $300,000 in fines. We're looking at wiring for flexible cords, wiring for cabinets and boxes and fittings, electrical equipment less than 600 volts, examination, installation and use, grounding requirements. It's pretty easy when you need to extend permanent power to say, well, let's just go to Fred Meyer's and buy a $30 cord, electrical extension cord, and we've extended our power. But you've created quite a few hazards by doing that, rather than doing it right, having a qualified electrician install electrical wiring up to code. Next slide, please. So in my site visits over the years as a compliance officer and as a consultant, these hazards are way too common. What I saw years ago, I see now. Again, as in our look at fire extinguishers, it becomes a matter of taking care of the details. These types of hazards are easily seen, but we choose to work around them. So we need to use our safety committees to make sure they're trained to ID these hazards and get them repaired. We need some accountability to keep them fixed. Next slide. So let's talk about safety committees. Again, not having them, 11 of 12 years, not keeping them documented, 10 of 12 years, not holding meetings frequently enough, 9 of 12 years, member requirements, training, 5 of 12 years, held on company time, 4 of 12 years, 7,600 citations, 275,000 in fines. Now, the whole point of this rule that was adopted back in 1990 was to foster communication between workers and management on what should be a shared goal, how to keep our workers from getting hurt. The fact that our compliance officers continue to find this rule not being followed in our workplace says something about, one, employee and employer relations, and two, the value we place in workplace safety. Our safety committees and safety meetings should be used as a tool to address those chemical falls, lockout, fire protection hazards that keep getting identified and cited. Next slide, please. Oh, you're there already. Machine guarding, total citations, almost 1,900, over 500,000 in tickets, 12 of 12 years. Abrasive wheel guarding, 9 of 12 years. Now, I remember the first accident investigation I ever did. I was 27. A 19-year-old young man, he got his arm caught in an unguarded belt drive in a little small cedar shingle mill. I remember interviewing him. He was a skinny kid living in a rundown, tiny little apartment. Now, he'd be in his early 50s now. So, I wonder what his life would have been like if that belt drive had been guarded. So when we look at all these cases of unguarded machinery and you think about the potential risk and hazard, you have to consider the consequence. It's usually not pretty. Next slide. Yeah, and these are hazards that I saw here just in the last year in workplaces I've been. These are the same ones that I was seeing, 20, 30 years ago. So again, we need to move forward on this. Next slide. Forklift operators training, 12 of 12 years. And you can see we've killed somebody on a forklift almost every year since 2008. Same comments I've been making about values and focus on safety applies here. You know, we continue to find workplaces with untrained forklift operators. Next slide. Eyewashes, 10 of 12 years, close to 1,000 violations, close to 130,000 in penalties. Okay, so this place, they put in an eyewash, but you can't just put it in and forget about it. Again, that lack of focus and attention to detail leads to these kind of hazards. Next slide, please. Respirators, 12 of 12 years, close to 1,400 citations, 156,000 in total fines. So a side effect of not having a good hazard communication program is employers and employees not knowing or choosing to ignore the effects of chemical exposures and how to protect their people. Not having respirators is a symptom of a poor hazard communication program. And then I also wonder if you look at that $156,000 in fines and you look at what CDC and federal OSHA says about the actual effects of chemical exposures, if that's accurate. Next slide. Bloodborne pathogens, 8 of 12 years, close to 700 citations, over 120,000 in fines. You know, same comments I've been making apply here. Next rule, please. Personal protective equipment assessment and eye and face protection, 6 of 12 years. Over 500 citations, over 61,000 in fines. And remember, the PPE rule went into effect in 2012, so we're not even looking at the years prior to that. And this is just the basic requirement to assess a workplace for hazards that need personal protective equipment. Again, what is that telling us about safety culture in our Oregon workplace? Next slide. Failure to have adequate exits, 6 of 12 years, close to 800 citations, almost 6,000 in fines. Next slide. Hard hats, 4 of 12 years, 408 citations, close to 80,000 in fines. Next slide. Compressed air, using compressed air above 29 PSI for cleaning purposes, over 300 citations, over 44,000 in fines. Next slide. And here we have, 90 citations back in 2008 under the old rule for open-sided platforms. 2018 and 2019, the new 4-foot rule in general industry made the top 25. Unfortunately, it may be here with us for a while. Especially when you consider that most fall hazards that take place in general industries behind closed doors as opposed to construction, which is out in the public view. So what is that telling us about the number of unsafe fall hazard acts that may be taking place in our general industry workplaces? Next slide, please. So if you look at here, you say, well, what's this about? Employer responsibilities. It's the second highest cited item. We pull, fall protection out. it kind of brings the rest of it into view. Hazard communication, lockout, guarding, you expect those to be relatively high. But employer responsibilities, we need to talk about that. Next slide. Let's look at that rule itself. It was cited 12 of 12 years. Total citations was close to 1,500, and total fines was over $1.1 million. What the rule says is that the employer must see that workers are properly instructed and supervised in the safe operation of any machinery, tool, equipment, process, or practice that they are authorized to use or apply. Now we're getting a little closer to the root cause maybe of why so many of the top citations continue to repeat year after year. Next slide, please. So for, if you take a look at this, you see that number of citations over the years and the number of fines over the years. And for each one of these citations, you got to remember there was some surface cause or condition that sent our compliance officers to our Division I employer responsibility supervisor role. Next slide, please. So if you take a look at forced supervision, you can definitely tie that as a root cause often to missing guards, the dirty eye washes, no lockout procedures, no respirators, no fall protection, no PPE, damaged electrical cords. You know, you can put a new guard on a grinder, but keeping that guard on the grinder, that's another story. You have to have good safety supervision to allow that. Rather than using a Band-Aid approach, we need to have a lasting fix. Next slide. So of course, the underlying factor of a lot of safety supervision issues is some form or level of lack of employer support. And when you have that kind of safety environment, one of the key building blocks or components, training, suffers. And another key building block, program components suffer, meaning, you know, those components that make up our lockout program, our permit programs, or respiratory programs, or hazard communication programs. Next slide, please. So let's take a look again at fall protection, and let's look at the focus of what was cited for fall hazards. There's usually a correlation between training and hazards. So the question is, why has training not been cited more? As you can see, fall risks was there all 12 years, documentation 7 years, but actually having a training program or an adequate training program was there only 2. Next slide. This pretty much illustrates the same question I'm raising. Next slide. And this too. So what are these slides telling us? It's telling us that we're not doing a good enough job of addressing the question, why are the falls happening? This is a pretty big question that can get pretty complicated. And I think specific to falls, that's for another day. But I did want to tie the connection between the training program component as opposed to the fall risk and how we're addressing that. Next slide. So I walked into this busy shop here a few years ago. There's a lot of activity. The workers were coming and going, in and out. and I see this guy on top of the step ladder in front of a door. That's an unsafe act, right? Well, the second unsafe condition that you don't see is that when I got the guy down off the step ladder and was telling him you can't do that, he got pretty lippy over the issue and said there wasn't a problem. Now, there's a third unsafe condition you don't see too. The supervisor who was taking me around doing the assessment, his eyes were on his toes the whole time. He didn't step up and address that hazard. So we got the worker down and he stopped what he was doing and we got the immediate hazard corrected. But what about the next day when the OSHA guy wasn't on site? So the premise we need to operate from is the hazards that we find in our workplace are usually symptoms of other underlying problems. If you don't address those, they're going to repeat. Now, Oregon OSHA folks are well aware of this relationship. We know that. But given the nature of compliance and the rules, it's often difficult to substantiate or identify. You know, it seems like year in and year out, you know, many employers are fixing the surface problems that get identified, but they just fix the surface problem and get back to work. Next slide. So most of the early OSHA rules were and still are kind of specific to design and equipment. It's like, you know, how wide is an exit door, exit signs, how wide is a walkway, how do you guard a chain and sprocket, a table saw, trigger heights for falls, what's the specification for standard railing, putting in a stairway. You know, identifying and citing these type of rules is pretty clear cut. Quick correction is pretty straightforward. The problem that was recognized decades ago, that keeping those hazards from popping up is more difficult. Now, years ago, decades ago, OSHA started moving toward performance-based rules, you know, lockout, tagout, permit required confined space, respiratory protection, hazard communication. However, for these performance standards to be successful, it relies on employee training and good safety supervision, employee involvement, and management support. And these rules can be difficult not only to write, but to enforce compared to those specific rules. And since these programs are made up of components, you know, like for energy control, we have lockout procedures, we have training, we have periodic inspections, we have accountability. It's more difficult to assess compared to if a railing is 42 inches high or not. Next slide. So one of the questions you need to ask is, in your organization, who's going to be managing these components and these programs? You know, oftentimes, you know, I find the folks who are supposed to, you know, they don't have the knowledge and or the time and or the resources and or the authority. Next slide. So one big corporation I worked with years ago, they hired a safety consultant to put together an extensive safety and health program. They had chapters covering all OSHA components for the type of hazards in the facilities. They had well-defined controls outlined. On paper, it looked really good. But when I visited the different mill sites, if that binder was even there, it was on a shelf not being used. When I would quiz, you know, the management team or supervisors there about it, why they weren't using it, either they didn't know it existed or they kind of scoffed and said, yeah, well, that's not how we do things here. So there's really no connection between how safety in these plants was being managed and what was in that corporate safety health program. So back in the 80s and 90s, a lot of safety folks, OSHA and some employers, they realized that the rules and the programs by themselves weren't adequate. A system was needed to make it all work. As an analogy, safety programs are like a computer hardware. Safety systems more like software. Without the software, a computer doesn't do much. Likewise, a safety program without a working system won't function well. Now, when I do consultations for Oregon employers, written programs are often shelf-bound. Workers, the supervisors, and managers that I talk to, they have sometimes a weak understanding of what's in the programs, what their purpose is, and they really have little to do what is actually happening out in the workplace. What's typically missing is the action and that work and the efforts that the company personnel at all levels need to take to implement those written program components. Next slide. Now, I have done no more than raise a lot of general questions on why the same hazards keep getting cited year after year. And I don't have a good answer for that big question. However, I do know how some employers have got ahead of the curve, and I do know how individual companies, if they have the desire and will, can do so also. Decades ago, OSHA saw the connection between sound management of safety programs and those employers who took care of hazards and didn't hurt workers. The Voluntary Protection Program, VPP, was created back in 1982. This program develops and implements systems to ID, evaluate, prevent, and control hazards. As a result, you find that the average VPP site is going to have a lost workday case incident rate about half of industry average. We have the Oregon OSHA SHARP program. It's another program to help employers develop an effective safety system. ANSI, they have a safety health management program. There's others too. I'm not particularly promoting one over the other, but the point here is to find a successful system to use as a template or a roadmap to get started. Next slide. So we're going to finish up this talk looking at some general attributes that employers with a strong safety system have. It's by no means inclusive, but it does hint at the path they are taking and need to be taking. So we look at management support, management commitment. You know, they're usually going to be using some type of a safety health management program as a roadmap to help them control their workplace hazards. And just as important, they view employee safety and health as a core value of their business. And they proactively manage safety health in their workplace just as they do the other components of their business. Next slide. So, and then supervisors. You know, our supervisors need to be clear on their safety responsibilities. They need to be trained on that. They need to know the hazards that their employees are exposed to, and they need to know how to control them. They need to be involved in employee safety training. And whether it's on a steep, brushy hillside with a logging crew, doing lathing work on a scaffold, working in a healthcare facility, a machine shop, they need to fix whatever hazards jump up and keep them fixed. They need to know how to provide positive enforcement, positive reinforcement. But at the same time, they need to be willing to use discipline when needed. Our supervisors have a critical role in maintaining effective safety systems. That can't be overstated. Next slide. And then our workers. We need workers who are comfortable telling their peers when they're doing something unsafe and being told when they're working unsafe. All employees need to receive hazard identification and job hazard analysis training. They need to tell anybody in the facility, the owner, the manager, OSHA, when they're not doing something safe or not following the rules. Now, quite a few years ago, I was doing a SHARP assessment at a big facility, and at lunchtime, the safety manager and I decided to go for a walk. We've been looking at programs, and our heads were a bit foggy. So we got out and walked around this facility, this huge facility. So we got to walking way out away from the work, and we're walking around, and all of a sudden we see a couple guys coming out of the building carrying a couple of vests. We didn't have our vests on, and the rule there was everybody needs to have a vest. Now these guys came up, they didn't know us from Adam, but they were very politely explained that, hey, when you're on our facility, for your safety, we want you wearing this high-vis vest. We thanked them, put them on, and continued on our way. Now that's an example of what we like to see. And we want to have employees need to have effective systems available to them for getting hazards fixed. Like good housekeeping, a workplace that has employees who are proactive in addressing safety issues is a really strong sign of an effective safety health program. Next slide. And then training. We want our new employees to have comprehensive new employee orientation, need to be tested for understanding, using on-the-job training, shadowing other workers, follow-up testing for comprehensive, et cetera. And for our long-term employees, they need to have ongoing training and review, again, testing for comprehensive, having employees provide training. Training is essential as an important component to keep hazards out of a workplace. So that's about what I have for you. But to conclude, I would say that if you want to keep those top cited hazards that we've been looking at out of your workplace, looking at the list isn't good enough. You're going to need to do that serious work to develop a strong safety culture and to build some type of a safety system that adequately addresses and controls those type of hazards in your workplace. There's a lot of resources out there available to help you towards that goal. And I would love to see a lot of those top hazards get knocked off that list. Thanks for your time. That's what I have.
Thank you so much, Lenny. That was a wonderful presentation. We really appreciate your time today. I also wanted to point out, and Mark Hurleman pointed out in the chat box, that the Redwood Safety Association will be hosting a webinar similar to this one on this Thursday, May 7th at noon, featuring Nathan Sweet from Oregon OSHA, who will be covering the Oregon OSHA response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And you can go to redwoodsafety.org and find the WebEx login information there. Thank you all so much, and stay safe out there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.